Martha Jane Robbins has been one of the coordinators of the Treaty Land Sharing Network since its inception in 2018. She grew up on a mixed organic farm in Treaty 6 territory at Laura, Saskatchewan, and has a background in farm politics and social movements through her work with the National Farmers Union. She is currently working on a PhD in international development from the International Institute of Social Studies in The Hague, the Netherlands. She lives in Saskatoon with her partner and 2 children. Doyle Wiebe is a 4th-generation farmer in the Langham community. He has applied his agricultural economics training as a farm financial management consultant, as an entrepreneur, having started several businesses, as well as served with his wife Valerie and their 2 sons a 3-year MCC term in Bangladesh, managing an agricultural program there. He is now semi-retired from farming and assisting each of his sons developing in their careers. Until recently, Doyle was active in leadership positions on boards of various farm associations and seniors housing. Let's welcome both Martha and Doyle. Thanks.
Martha and I talked a couple weeks ago, and we agreed that I should go first. Maybe I'll get this up a little higher. I will make one little apology to start. I don't know when it's going to happen, but likely will during my presentation, that some things that are close to my heart will rise to my throat a little bit. I was asked to participate in this conference due to a decision I made last winter to be involved with a new initiative that can involve any landowner. As a farmer, whenever I would hear about some of the historical wrongs regarding land that were imposed on our First Nations people and now being challenged in the courts, my heart would sort of skip a beat, as essentially I had a bit of a conflict of interest in any further discussion. My staying neutral position was at times challenged by my own children, and when I finally did come to the decision I will describe in a few minutes, I also realized that this does not happen in a vacuum. You don't just wake up one day with a whole new perspective and resulting position on an issue as complex as settler-Indigenous relations. At least I don't. So before I talk directly about the decision, I think it would be useful to share a selection of events in my life that have led to this point. Hopefully some will resonate with some of you, as you may be somewhere on your own journey. We're all on this journey. Of learning and discerning what is true and right, and how these discernments will impact our lives. And as our journey goes, there may be times when we are forced to stop, to take stock of what we're thinking about a certain issue and what we're doing or not doing, and be willing to say to ourselves, I may have been wrong all these years. I think I need to rethink and possibly change my view. The first step in solving such a dilemma is properly identifying what the problem is. This is where I essentially found myself about 15 years ago regarding my view of Indigenous Canadians. I had been confronted over the previous several years with 2 viewpoints that were essentially opposite each other on how to view the First Nations settler relationship. I needed to come to terms with those differences. Growing up in my community, the closest connection I had with any Indigenous people was a couple of foster children in our church, who today are referred to as being part of the 60s scoop. I do not recall any disparaging remarks in my home regarding this part of our society, and I also did not learn a lot about the history of the relationship between Indigenous and settler peoples in school. It just wasn't talked about. One of my first direct interactions with a First Nations peer came at university, For all my 4 years there, a fellow student from the Chittick Lake Reserve studied alongside the rest of us, and I remember some professors commenting near graduation that they were proud to have been able to have taught the first Indigenous graduate from the College of Agriculture. I never detected resentment that his education had likely been free to him, nor any discrimination as small groups of graduates, including him, met socially over the ensuing years. Fast forward about 20 years to 1998 or so, and a 10-year-old business I'm part of at that time with two partners is faced with having to make a decision. Either partner up with a tribal council made up of 12 First Nations to grow the business, but not own it all of it, or risk losing what we had. I saw it as a business opportunity and started working on how to make the new business structure work for all. Then came my first real encounter with prejudice. One partner sold out to get away from the planned new business relationship. The other stayed, but often lamented the cost of the relationship, calling it a northern tax. I started wondering where all of this contempt for a race of people was coming from. For the remaining years that I was involved in that business, the relationship with the tribal council worked well. Having become more interested in all sorts of news in the ensuing years, I noted many stories of both the plight of First Nations people as well as the sentiments of white people, Anglo-Saxon people, descendants of settler people, who seemed unable to say anything positive about the Indigenous people. As much as I did not participate in these conversations, I did nothing to question the seemingly factual accounts of horrendous behavior, living conditions, substance abuse, and crime, all couched in resentment for the fact that they were living on the backs of taxpayers and the suggestion that the money should just stop. But something got me thinking that the wisdom being parsed out at these places, such as the coffee shop, may be lacking some relevant facts. As with many big picture issues I hear about, I knew learning more would help. I started asking questions, like a young child does. Why? Why are Indigenous people committing more crimes? Answer: poverty, broken homes, mental health issues, substance abuse. Why are there so many families and mental health problems? 100 plus years of residential schools separating families, among many other factors. Why did we have residential schools for 100 years? We elected and re-elected governments that supported that system. We, the white settler people, but that system was created long before I or even my parents were born. Why did some church and political leaders see the need to apologize on my behalf? I think it was essentially because they finally realized the extent of the lasting societal trauma and other negative impacts on a distinct group of citizens that far outweighed any of the benefits that had been the reason for creating the system in the first place. A turning point for me came about 15 years ago, a church event at Camp Shekina. An Indigenous elder spoke of not only the abuses of residential schools, but also the long-term impact on the family unit. My takeaway was to think about this. Over successful generations of separation, parents forgot what it means to be a parent. Children without parents in their lives are not shown what parents do, what grandparents do. So when they grow up, they both have not had parental care and the mentoring for their time later as parents. But also as a millennial culture becomes a confusing set of contrasts to a culture they really don't understand. I've summed up that presentation along with other revelations of atrocities, like unmarked graves more recently, in a couple sentences. For more than 5 generations of being treated scarcely better than animals, the impacts of a rare race of people cannot be fixed, forgotten, or gotten over for many more generations to come. It is essentially ludicrous to suggest it is now their problem because the source of the trauma is gone, which is something I've heard as recently as a month ago in my own community. Ongoing reading of stories of discrimination, incarceration, and police mistreatment had me still trying to make sense of this relationship between Indigenous and settler peoples. Trying to connect the dots, as it were. And then more recently, over just a couple of years, 3 events further influenced my resolve to come to terms with the need to act when situations presented themselves. First, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission hearings and report moved the dial of collective consciousness of this relationship issue for every Canadian. One direct result is the now common acknowledgement of how we are meeting today here on Treaty 6 land. Second, a Superior Court ruling in Thunder Bay in favor of a First Nation land claim noted the following as part of why the ruling was made. It said, Queen Victoria, the monarch at the time of the treaty negotiations, in related communications had clearly stated that the British were not to be seen as invaders, not conquering new lands. The Indigenous were to be treated fairly, not ruthlessly. I found Treaty 6 online. Indeed, it does use language of fairness, of sharing land, not dividing it up. Third, the Colton Bushy tragedy and the vitriolic, hate-filled response. It was incredible enough to hear it on social media, but even in our own community, in a personal encounter, I heard a local man essentially say, if a stranger comes on your yard, you can shoot them, with the obvious inference, if it is an Indigenous person. I was shocked. It was the most flagrant demonstration of the R word I'd ever experienced. It got me thinking more. I've now been able to come to some personal conclusions, some truths that will anchor my actions going forward until I'm better informed and tweak them again. 1, I am a treaty person. As treaties were made in perpetuity between 2 peoples. They are not peace treaties to end hostilities per se. They were and are negotiated agreements, not imposed, to begin something, a new and ongoing relationship. 2, the Indigenous culture had never even conceived of land ownership at the time of treaty negotiations, as we heard this morning. To them, the land, the sky, the air were created for us to use while we are alive. This contrast with our ownership system creates problems. We, settler people, have been led to believe the Indigenous want all their land back, all the land back. To the extent that some land that was specifically identified in a treaty as theirs and subsequently taken away, there are efforts, as we've heard, to rectify that in certain cases. But for the most part, they just want the sharing of what the land has to offer to be honored. 3, white privilege is simply never being disadvantaged due to my skin color. Until you see or hear firsthand accounts, it is really hard to appreciate what this privilege means, but it is real. We, settler people, stole the dignity of the First Nations people, and we need to find ways to give it back. Sure, just as there are many First Nations people who have achieved personal self-worth and have their dignity, there are, unfortunately, many who may never achieve that goal. First Nations are not and never have been a homogeneous group. Historically, each nation had a somewhat unique culture. Some were more aggressive and others less so, and so on. Many of those historic differences still exist, making an effort to reconcile the past with the present that much more difficult, but an aspiration worth pursuing. I do not think there is much, or 5, I do not think there is much to be gained by debating whether today's settler descendants should bear responsibility for causing today's problems. But that being said, I think we need to think long and hard about how we can take responsibility to be part of resolving them. 6, I need to find ways to cause people near me to think twice when they disparage First Nations people. It is awkward in a group situation, but I know there must be ways to do it without permanently severing long-time relationships. And 7, as much as I think First Nations are entitled to every dollar being received, and as a taxpayer some of it comes from me, money does not convey respect, which is a necessary part of restoring dignity. And I need to find ways to convey respect without sounding paternalistic or sanctimonious. So now, what have I done? What decision did I make? This past spring, I decided to join the Treaty Land Sharing Network by placing a sign on some farmland I own that invites Indigenous people to visit. I know most of you don't own farmland, so this gesture of support may not be an option, but there are and will be other opportunities to demonstrate a willingness to build, to repair a relationship that has gone so wrong. Be curious, ask questions, seek out others of like mind to collaborate or emulate. It will take some effort, but will be worth it. Some say I'm taking some risks. I probably am, but I think it's time I do, and hope others do too, so we can move forward to build positive connections. Martha will now say more about the network, as she has been involved in it from the start.
Thank you, Doyle, for sharing, for sharing your personal journey. So my name is Martha Robbins, and I'm one of 7 women who are on the coordinating committee for the Treaty Land Sharing Network. And as was mentioned already, I grew up on a mixed organic farm that my parents and my brother still farm, and I grow a big vegetable garden out there as well. And I'd like to start, before I tell you a little bit about the network, I'd like to start by acknowledging the Nahiwak, Anishinaabe, Lakota, Nakota, Dakota, and Métis peoples. And to say that our Treaty Land Sharing Network is a project that's aimed at recognizing the land and the territories of First Nations and Métis people in practice. So we see the work of the Treaty Land Sharing Network as a land acknowledgement itself. So this photo, I'll try and go fairly quickly through the slides, so I don't want to give a huge talk, but just a little intro into what the network is. But this photo was at our public launch, which was July 15th, 2021. And it was held at Mary Smiley and Ian McCreary's farm at Bladworth, Saskatchewan. And this was a culmination of 3 years of work. And at the same time, of course, is just the beginning. This was the first time that we had launched the network publicly and had media in attendance. So what is the Treaty Land Sharing Network? I'm not sure how many of you folks have heard of the Treaty Land Sharing Network, so I'll just give you a little brief overview. It's a group of farmers and ranchers and other landholders who are honoring treaties by sharing the land, is the basic premise. It started through a conversation with one of our coordinators and a land-based educator from Papikassis Cree Nation in 2018. And in 2019, we had a series of gatherings to begin to organize both settler and starting with the organizing settler or non-Indigenous landholders alone. And then we also had meetings with Indigenous people as well. It's motivated, the network is motivated by a shrinking land base for Indigenous people to practice their inherent and treaty rights. And we've seen that through the selling off of Crown lands is one example. And also, of course, by the killing of Colton Boushie and the ramping up of rural racism that happened after his death. So the network, the idea is to provide safe access for Indigenous people to practice their way of life on the lands that we farm. It's about implementing treaty relationships, and it's about establishing a different way forward for rural Saskatchewan. So we believe that before reconciliation comes truth, and that we have at least two hard truths to face in the province, in rural Saskatchewan. We have a substantial problem with racism. And we as settlers have not honored treaty. We have not grappled with the basis of colonialism, which is the takeover of the land. So one of the goals of the network is to work on educating ourselves as settlers and having those tough conversations with our neighbors. And it's also about honoring and practicing treaty, which is a way to begin the work of reconciliation. And this photo was at one of our land sharing events at Joel Mochenko's farm in July of 2020, which is in the southern part of the province. So by treaties, we mean the network understands treaties as relationships among nations, including non-humans, frameworks that can guide us over time, meant to be renewed and reaffirmed, and sharing the land for mutual benefit and coexistence. And that it involves rights, responsibilities, and commitments. So during treaty negotiations, Indigenous nations agreed to share the land with settlers, not to cede or surrender it. Treaties were not intended to establish a static set of terms that would be fixed in time, but rather to provide a framework that is dynamic, relational, and contextual, and that could guide the interactions of treaty partners over time. So as Star Blanket says, to Indigenous peoples, treaties were regarded as land use frameworks, which generally involve the establishment of separate governments and jurisdictions in distinct spaces, and dual governance and jurisdiction in shared spaces and matters of mutual concern. So why do we need to work on this particular project, or what motivates us? Treaty and inherent rights are increasingly difficult to exercise. 85% of land below the tree line in Saskatchewan is privately owned or leased. Only 10% of original native prairie remains. Reserve lands make up only 1.5% of Saskatchewan's land base. The province is rapidly selling off crown lands. And of course, as I mentioned before, rural racism and trespassing legislation are making rural areas increasingly hostile for Indigenous peoples to practice their rights. Since 2007, just a quick statistic, the Saskatchewan government has sold nearly 2 million acres of crown land, which totals close to twice the size of Prince Albert National Park. And Indigenous people, of course, hold both inherent and treaty rights to move freely throughout these territories and to use and steward the plants and animals in these lands. This photo is from our farm, our family farm, which was a land sharing event that we held in June of this past year, 2022. And it was a joint event where we also invited classrooms from Saskatoon to participate in the land sharing event. So these next slides I'll go through really quickly, but if you're interested in sharing the land, we have a website. So the process is that you can sign your land up to the network, as Doyle has done. This is one way to do that is on our website. The way that we're seeing the Treaty Land Sharing Network as something that we can do right now to deliver some access for Indigenous people to practice their inherent and treaty rights, but not as an end goal necessarily. Of course, the way treaties intended, you wouldn't need signs and a website that shows a directory of where you can access your rights. Those rights are supposed to be accessible everywhere. But this is one way that we're starting to build that awareness in rural Saskatchewan. And we're attempting to deepen our understanding and our practice of the true spirit and intent of treaties. So the next slide, this is just a slide that shows you kind of how our website works. Land users are asked to phone landholders before their initial visit. We've had a lot of discussion in the network about having as few barriers to access as possible, but also recognizing, and as we've built this in conversation with Indigenous people, We heard over and over again concerns about safety. And so, so the ideal goal is as few barriers, ideally no barriers to access, but we are asking at this moment for land users to phone landholders before their initial visit so that location details as well as any information to ensure safety can be communicated. The protocols that are signed onto at the moment when joining the network are that land can be accessed for gathering plants, medicines, and rocks, hunting, and ceremony, and additional uses may be discussed with landholders. Access to land will be on foot. All gates must be left as they are found. Open fires are not permitted unless all parties involved are in agreement. And communication will be open, respectful, and non-judgmental. Of course, the organizers of the network can always operate as facilitators or mediators with any interactions. So the next slide shows, so that previous slide showed you some of our the map. And then when you go further into the website, you'll see, so the nearest location, and then the name of the landholder, and then a little description about what the land is with all of these symbols. The symbols in the directory point to various elements that might be useful for Indigenous people at the various sites. Now, this is something that we're also doing a lot of learning on as we are having more interaction with folks who are coming out to the land, because of course, settlers know very little in most cases about what might be useful for Indigenous folks on the land. One kind of funny story that we had was one of our first interactions was an elder asking about rocks for sweat lodges, and a farmer saying, like, rocks? I would never have thought that rocks. For me, rocks are the bane of my existence on this land. And you know, that's the thing that would be of interest to you. It's amazing. So we're learning as we go. So if you go to the next slide, then so then you see a kind of a more full description of what that piece of land has on it, and contact information for the landholder. So then I'll just skip to the next one. This is an example of, this is our sign. This was actually at the public launch. So that's Mary and Ian. This is Office of the Treaty Commissioner, Commissioner Mary Culbertson, and Brad Desjardins. So we partnered officially with the Office of the Treaty Commissioner in a ceremony in August of 2020, and we have an ongoing relationship with the OTC. They have 3 or 4 members of the OTC who sit on our coordinating committee. We've also had utilized grant funding from Sask Culture, the United Church of Canada, and the Government of Saskatchewan's First Nations and Métis Community Partnership Projects Fund for the various events that we've held. So I think, just to end, I think that some of the key pieces of the work that we're doing in the network is that the role we're seeing that the role of non-Indigenous people is key to doing the work and bearing the burden of educating ourselves and educating other settlers. That's not work that, it's that work of building anti-racism within rural Saskatchewan, of doing the decolonization work and having those tough conversations with our neighbors is our work. And we're trying to take that on as much as possible through educational events and book clubs and other spaces. And we've also learned, we've had this ongoing tension between learning that relationships are key, but also not wanting to erect barriers. So not expecting land users to be in relationship with the landholders. And that's a really key thing that has evolved over time within the network. There's often, I think, as settlers, we have this, especially settlers who are trying to do something with good intention. There's this expectation that others will want to be in relation with us, and that we're going to gain a lot from this relationship, right? That we're going to learn a lot about what's on our land, and we've discovered, of course, so the first piece, again, is to reiterate that we're trying to have as few barriers to access as possible. So there's no expectation for land users to just come and have coffee with you. There is no expectation that you're going to have a relationship with the people that are coming to your land. But we've also learned that relationships are key, and building these relations are really important. So the model of the network now is that we build relationships through the network and not through the individual land use moments. So we hold these land sharing events that are between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. We're creating as many spaces as we can to build ongoing relationships. We are now in a process of connecting. Now we have enough members that we're in a process of connecting landholders with First Nations that are nearby, geographically speaking, and trying to build relations more directly. So we're trying to do that relationship building in a different way without erecting barriers for land use. And I think the other thing that we've decided is that we need to have some sort of advocacy role, and so we've done in specific moments pushback against the further encroachment and limitations on land access. So we've had a petition and an open letter that we spearheaded against the Crown land sales. We've also done media work around the trespassing legislation and other moments where we see that it's important for settlers to also be pushing back and not just expecting First Nations to be doing that pushback alone. So I think that our hope is that our signs are going to be frequent enough and recognizable enough over time that most people will feel comfortable accessing the land that way. But at the moment, mostly I think it's less from drive-bys and more from the website or word of mouth or those kind of things. And I guess the last thing I'd leave you with is an invitation that if you have land, if you are a landholder, consider joining the network and the work that we are doing. If you have connections or are an Indigenous person and are looking for places to hunt, gather, hold ceremony, collect medicines, harvest medicine, please consider connecting with us, and we'll do our best to connect with the pieces of land that may have what you're looking for. And I think the last thing I'll leave you with is, it's not on here. The last thing I was going to leave you with is our website, which is just treatylandsharingnetwork.ca, in case folks are interested. There's many other issues and experiences that we've had along the way, but I just wanted to give you a brief introduction to what we're working on. Thank you.
Oy, oy. That was awesome. Thank you, Doyle, and thank you, Martha. Another session of just really some beautiful minds and your willingness to share some personal stories and a lot of effort and work also on both of your parts. So thank you again very much for sharing with all of us today. Another round of applause, please. So we have learned a lot from some really beautiful, beautiful people today. And we've been also sitting with some really beautiful people today and had a little bit of a chance to chat, and we wanted to give some more opportunity for us to discuss at our groups. So they're hosts. We have hosts. If we didn't know that, or Denise didn't know that, we have hosts at our tables that will help to guide some conversations. So we will be going till about 3 o'clock. So I think you have like 18 minutes for some discussion. Again, look to your table hosts. They will guide through some conversations. And at 3 o'clock, we will have our closing. So enjoy your conversation.